The 9th of May, 1945. A holding facility in Bavaria, southern Germany. The war in Europe had been over for exactly 1 day. The SS general had dressed carefully that morning. His uniform was pressed, his medals were straight. He had polished his boots. He was 61 years old, heavy-set, with the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades expecting rooms to go quiet when he entered them. He had commanded divisions. He had signed orders. He had been, for most of his adult life, one of the most powerful men in the country he had helped destroy. Now he was waiting in a room that smelled of cold stone, and he was preparing to ask for something he had never asked for before. He was preparing to beg. The American officer who came to collect him was a captain, 26 years old, from Ohio. The captain did not salute. He said, "Get up," and the general got up, and they walked down a corridor to a larger room where several American officers were seated at a table with documents in front of them. The general looked at the documents and understood that this was not the meeting he had requested. He had asked specifically to speak with General Eisenhower. He had sent the request through 3 separate channels over the preceding 48 hours. He had explained, in writing, that he had information of strategic value, that he could be useful, that there were things he knew that the Americans would want to know. He had not said the other thing, the real thing, the thing that was underneath all the carefully worded requests. He had not written that he was afraid of what came next. If you want more stories like this one, the moments inside the war that the history books leave out, subscribe before we go further. It costs you nothing, and it tells us this work is worth continuing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was 54 years old in May 1945. He was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. He had planned and executed the largest amphibious invasion in history. He had managed coalitions of generals whose egos and national interests pulled in different directions, and he had held them together through 3 years of the most complex military operations ever attempted. He was, by the judgment of history and by the assessment of anyone who worked closely with him, one of the finest military administrators who ever lived. He was also a man who had walked through Ohrdruf. On the 12th of April 1945, less than a month before the war ended, Eisenhower visited the Ohrdruf concentration camp with General Patton and General Bradley. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald. It was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces on the Western Front. What the 3 generals found there, the bodies, the survivors, the evidence of what had been done, and how long it had been done, was documented in Eisenhower's own words in letters he wrote that week. He wrote that the things he saw were beyond the power of words to describe. He wrote that he went through the entire camp, room by room, because he wanted the memory of it burned into him so completely that he would never be able to forget it, and so that he could speak to it personally if anyone ever tried to claim it had not happened. He ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp. He ordered journalists and photographers brought in. He understood, in April 1945, with a precision that would prove entirely correct, that there would come a time when people would deny what he was seeing, and he wanted witnesses. He ordered the German civilians of the nearby town to be marched through the camp. He required them to look. The mayor of the town and his wife went home that evening and killed themselves. This is the context in which the SS general's request arrived on Eisenhower's desk. The general's name, in the reconstructed accounts of this period, is not always specified. What is specified is his rank, his history, and the nature of what he was asking. He was a senior SS commander who had served in an administrative capacity in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. His work had involved the coordination of what the SS called special actions. The documents that American intelligence teams had already recovered from his former headquarters described those actions in the precise, technical language of bureaucratic murder. The documents bore his signature. He had been captured without resistance at a roadblock near Munich. He had not attempted to flee. He had, by several accounts, seemed almost relieved to be in American custody rather than Soviet. This was not unusual. The senior SS commanders who understood what the Red Army was doing to their counterparts in the East had made a calculation. American custody meant lawyers. American custody meant procedures. American custody meant the possibility, however slim, of outcomes other than the one that awaited them in the East. He had also made a second calculation, one that was common among senior Nazi officials in those days. He believed that the Americans needed what he had. He had information about Soviet military dispositions. He had information about the German intelligence networks that were still operating in the East. He had names and locations and operational details that, he was certain, would be of considerable value to people who were already beginning to think about the next war. He was not wrong that the Americans wanted this information. He was wrong about what it was worth to them and what they would give for it. The request to speak with Eisenhower arrived at the general's headquarters in Reims, and then, as the command moved, in Frankfurt. It was read by several of Eisenhower's staff officers. It was assessed. And it was eventually brought to Eisenhower's attention not because of its content, but because of its persistence. The general had sent the same request, in varying forms, 5 times in 4 days. He had become, in the administrative language of the headquarters, a problem requiring disposition. Eisenhower read the requests. He read the summary of who was asking and what he was asking for. He read the intelligence assessment of what the man actually knew and whether it was genuinely valuable. The assessment was that some of it might be useful, and some of it was almost certainly already known through other sources. He did not write a long response. He did not schedule a meeting. He sent back a single instruction, passed down through the staff, that has been preserved in various forms in the accounts of officers who were present or who received word of it in the days that followed. He said he would not see him. This requires some explanation, because to someone unfamiliar with the culture and protocol of military command, it might seem like a simple administrative decision. A busy general declining a meeting with a prisoner. Understandable, unremarkable. It was not unremarkable. It was a precise and deliberate act. The SS general had framed his request as one soldier to another. He had used the language of military professionalism. He had appealed implicitly to the idea that men who had commanded at the highest levels of their respective armies shared something that transcended the specific circumstances of the war. He had, in the careful phrasing of his written requests, positioned himself as a fellow general, offering information to a colleague, not as a prisoner petitioning a captor. Eisenhower's refusal to see him was a refusal of that entire framing. It said, without a word of explanation, "You are not my colleague. You are not someone I will meet with. You are not a general in any sense that I recognize." The SS commander received the reply through the same channels he had used to send the request. The captain from Ohio came back to the room where he was waiting and told him that his request had been declined. The general asked if there was any possibility of appeal. The captain said no. The general asked if the refusal was final. The captain said yes. The general sat down. What happened next is documented in several accounts, all of them consistent in their essential details. The general, who had maintained his composure through the processing and the waiting and the requests and the declining, asked the captain a question. He asked whether General Eisenhower understood what was in the documents that had been captured at his headquarters, whether Eisenhower knew what his signature appeared on. The captain said yes. The general was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that has been quoted differently in different accounts, but whose substance is consistent across all of them. He said something to the effect that he had believed, when it was over, that there would be a reckoning in the proper sense, that there would be proceedings, that there would be an opportunity to explain the context, that people would understand that what had been done was done within a system, under orders, in a framework that had its own logic and its own necessity, and that the men who had operated within that framework were not the same as the men who had designed it. He said some version of this, and the captain from Ohio listened to it And then, the captain from Ohio said something that is also consistent across the accounts. He said that General Eisenhower had been to Ohrdruf. The general did not respond to this. The captain left. The general remained in the room. The proceedings that followed were the Nuremberg trials. They opened in November 1945. Senior SS commanders were among those tried. The defense that was offered, in various forms, by most of the defendants was the defense the general in the Bavarian holding room had been rehearsing: the system, the orders, the framework, the context, the necessity. The tribunal rejected it. Not entirely context and coercion could be considered in mitigation, but the core argument that participation in a criminal system absolved the participant of individual responsibility for the crimes of that system was rejected with a clarity that established one of the foundational principles of modern international law. Eisenhower did not attend the trials. He was already dealing with the occupation and the politics of the post-war world. But the principle that his refusal to meet with the SS general had embodied, that rank did not confer immunity, that professional service did not excuse the purposes it was put to, that a man who signed orders for mass murder was not a colleague to be met with as an equal. That principle was the same one that the Nuremberg tribunal put into legal language. The SS general was eventually tried. The proceedings took place in 1947 as part of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The documents from his headquarters were entered into evidence. His signature appeared on them. He offered the defense he had been preparing. The tribunal convicted him. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. He was released in the early 1950s as part of the commutation program that affected many convicted war criminals during the transition from occupation to the Federal Republic. He died in West Germany in the 1960s. His name does not appear in most general histories of the period. Eisenhower became President of the United States in 1953. He served 2 terms. He died in 1969. He had been, for most of his life after the war, a public figure of enormous stature, celebrated for the liberation of Europe and for his steady, calm management of the early Cold War. The decision not to see the SS general was not mentioned in most of the public accounts of his career. It was the kind of decision that does not generate headlines: a refusal, a closed door, a piece of paper sent back through channels. It did not involve tanks or landings or the movement of armies. What it involved was a judgment about who was entitled to what, made by a man who had walked through Ohrdruf 3 weeks earlier and understood, in the most concrete physical terms, what the organization represented by the man requesting the meeting had actually been. The SS general had dressed carefully that morning and polished his boots and prepared his arguments and sent his requests through the proper channels. He had done everything correctly, according to the conventions of the world he had lived in. The conventions had changed. Eisenhower's refusal was the notification. There is a dimension of this story that is easy to miss if you focus only on the refusal itself. The refusal was the visible part. The invisible part was what it cost. Eisenhower was, by temperament and by professional training, a man who gathered information. His entire career as a military commander had been built around the principle that you needed to know what the enemy knew, what they were planning, where they were weak. He had presided over the largest intelligence operation in American history. He understood, better than almost anyone in the Allied command, the value of human sources. The SS general was offering human intelligence. He was offering information about Soviet dispositions at a moment when the Soviet Union was rapidly becoming the primary strategic concern of American military planners. The Cold War had not yet been named, but it had already begun, and the people around Eisenhower who dealt with intelligence were already thinking about what they would need to know about the Soviets in the coming years and where they would get it. The information was not worthless. The refusal to take the meeting had a cost. Eisenhower paid it. He paid it because the alternative, the meeting, the handshake, the transaction, would have meant something that he was not willing to have it mean. It would have meant that what was in those documents, the operational orders for what had been done in the occupied territories, the careful bureaucratic language in which the destruction of entire communities had been organized and managed, it would have meant that all of that could be set aside in exchange for information of sufficient value. He had been to Ohrdruf. He knew what that exchange would cost. The captain from Ohio who told the SS general that General Eisenhower had been to Ohrdruf was not delivering a message that Eisenhower had sent. He was answering a question, but the answer was the message. It explained the refusal better than any formal communication could have. The general had asked whether Eisenhower understood what was in the documents. The captain had confirmed that he did. And then, without further elaboration, the captain had said where Eisenhower had been. The connection between those two facts was the entire content of the refusal. Eisenhower had seen what the documents described. He had seen it in physical reality, in the concrete and the mud and the bodies of Ohrdruf. And having seen it, he had made a decision about what he was and was not willing to do. He was not willing to sit across a table from the man who had organized it and treat the meeting as a professional transaction between military colleagues. That was the decision. Not dramatic, not public, just a door that did not open. The SS general had polished his boots. The door stayed closed. The broader pattern of how Eisenhower handled the SS in the final weeks and immediate aftermath of the war is worth examining because the refusal to meet the general was not an isolated decision. It was consistent with a series of choices that Eisenhower made, quietly and without public announcement, about what the American military was going to be willing to do and what it was not. He had refused to salute SS officers who were brought into American custody. He had refused to shake hands with the German surrender delegation at Reims, meeting with them only after the documents were signed, and only to confirm that they understood the terms. He had, in the words of one of his staff officers, established a consistent practice of denying the courtesies of the profession to men whose conduct had forfeited any claim to them. This was not cruelty. Eisenhower was not a cruel man. It was something more deliberate and more considered. It was the application of a principle, that the conventions of military honor were not available to men who had operated outside the conventions of human decency. The SS general in the Bavarian holding room had expected a different world. He had expected a world in which his rank, his information, and his willingness to cooperate would be sufficient currency to buy him a seat at the table. He had expected the professional military culture of the old Europe to survive the war the same way it had survived previous wars, intact, transferable, available to men on both sides once the shooting stopped. What he encountered instead was Eisenhower's refusal, which was not the refusal of one general to meet with another. It was the refusal of a man who had been to Ohrdruf to pretend that the preceding 12 years had not happened. The door stayed closed. That was the answer. The war had been over for one day, when the general dressed carefully and polished his boots and waited in the room with the cold stone walls. He would wait for many more days before he understood that no amount of careful dressing would open the door he was standing behind. Eisenhower had seen what was on the other side of it. The post-war world that emerged from the rubble of 1945 was built, in part, on decisions like this one. Decisions that were not dramatic, that did not involve armies or weapons or the movement of forces, but that established what the victors were willing to accept and what they were not. The Nuremberg trials were the formal expression of this principle. Eisenhower's closed door was an informal one. Both said the same thing. They said that the war had not been a game between professional soldiers who happened to be on different sides, a game that ended when one side lost and both shook hands and went home. They said that what had been done in the occupied territories, in the camps, in the operations whose documents bore the signatures of men like the general in the holding room, was not the normal conduct of war that military tradition had always regarded as acceptable even between enemies. They said that there were lines that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed by the mere fact of defeat. The SS general had crossed them. He had crossed them with careful paperwork and correct administrative procedure and the precise technical language of bureaucratic efficiency. He had crossed them from behind a desk in an office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and he had believed, perhaps until the moment the captain from Ohio told him where Eisenhower had been, that the desk and the office and the paperwork had insulated him from what the paperwork described. Eisenhower had been to Ohrdruf. The insulation did not hold. The general polished his boots. The door stayed closed. The war was over, and the reckoning had begun, and the reckoning did not require a meeting. Now here is what I want to ask you. The SS general believed that his information gave him leverage, that what he knew was worth something, that there was a deal to be made. If you had been Eisenhower, and you knew that the information was genuinely valuable, would you have taken the meeting? Would the intelligence have been worth sitting across a table from him? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Subscribe if you want to see what comes next. See you tomorrow.